Later that evening, Bruno was disappointed to find Lieutenant Kotler was joining him, mother, father, and Gretel for dinner. Pavel was wearing his white jacket as usual and served them as they ate. Bruno watched Pavel as he went around the table and found that he felt sad whenever he looked at him. He wondered whether the white jacket he wore as a waiter was the same as the white jacket he had worn before as a doctor. As he brought the plates in and set them down in front of each of them, and while they ate their food and talked, he stepped back towards the wall and held himself perfectly still, neither looking ahead nor not. It was as if his body had gone to sleep, standing up and with his eyes open. Whenever anyone needed anything, Pavel would bring it immediately, but the more Bruno watched him, the more he was sure that catastrophe was going to strike. He seemed to grow smaller and smaller each week, if such a thing were possible, and the colour that should have been in his cheeks had drained almost entirely away. His eyes appeared heavy with tears, and Bruno thought that one good blink might bring on a torrent. When Pavel came in with the plates, Bruno couldn't help but notice that his hands were shaking slightly under the weight of them, and when he stepped back to his usual position, he seemed to sway on his feet and had to press his hand up against the wall to steady himself. Mother had to ask twice for her extra helping of soup before he heard her, and he let the bottle of wine empty without having opened another one in time to fill Father's glass.
Her lizard don't let us read poetry or plays,
complained Bruno during the main course. As they had company for dinner, the family were dressed formally, Father in his uniform, Mother in a green dress then that set off her eyes, and Gretel and Bruno in the clothes they wore to church when they lived in Berlin.
I asked him if we could read them just one day a week, but he said no, not while he was in charge of our education.
I'm sure he has his reasons,
said Father, attacking a leg of lamb.
All he wants us to do is study history and geography,
said Bruno.
And I'm starting to hate history and geography.
Don't say hate, Bruno, please,
said Mother.
Why do you hate history?
asked Father, laying down his fork for a moment and looking across the table at his son, who shrugged his shoulders, a bad habit of his.
Because it's boring.
Boring,
said Father.
A son of mine calling the study of history boring. Let me tell you this, Bruno.
He went on, leaning forward and pointing his knife at the boy.
It's history that's got us here today. If it wasn't for history, none of us would be sitting around this table now. We'd be safely back at our table in our house in Berlin. We're correctly history here.
It's still boring,
repeated Bruno, who wasn't really paying attention.
You'll have to forgive my brother, Lieutenant Kotler,
said Gretel, laying a hand on his arm for a moment, which made Mother stare at her and narrow her eyes.
He's a very ignorant little boy.
I am not ignorant,
snapped Bruno, who had had enough of her insults.
You have to forgive my sister, Lieutenant Kotler,
he added politely.
But she's a hopeless case. There's very little we can do for her. The doctor says she's gone past the point of health.
Oh, shut up,
said Gretel, blushing scarlet.
You shut up,
said Bruno with a broad smile.
Children, please,
said Mother. Father tapped his knife on the table and everyone was silent. Bruno glanced in his direction. He didn't look angry exactly, but he did look as if he wasn't going to put up with much more arguing.
I enjoyed history very much when I was a boy,
said Lieutenant Kotler after a few silent moments.
And although my father was a professor of literature at the university, I preferred the social sciences to the arts.
I didn't know that, Kurt,
said Mother, turning to look at him for a moment.
Does it still teach then?
I suppose so,
said Lieutenant Kotler.
I don't really know.
Well, how can you not know?
She asked, frowning at him.
Don't you keep in touch with him?
The young lieutenant chewed on a mouthful of lamb, and it gave him an opportunity to think of a reply. He looked to Bruno as if he regretted having brought the matter up in the first place.
Kurt,
Repeated Mother.
don't you keep in touch with your father?
Not really.
He replied, shrugging his shoulders dismissively and not turning his head to look at her.
He left Germany some years ago. 1938, I think it was. I haven't seen him since then.
Father stopped eating for a moment and stared across at Lieutenant Kotler, frowning slightly.
And where did he go?
He asked.
I beg your pardon, Herr Commandant.
Asked Lieutenant Kotler, even though Father had spoken in a perfectly clear voice.
I asked you where he went.
He repeated.
Your father, the professor of literature, where did he go when he left Germany?
Lieutenant Kotler's face grew a little red and he stuttered somewhat as he spoke.
I believe he is currently in Switzerland.
He said finally.
The last I heard, he was teaching at the university in Bern.
Oh, but Switzerland's a beautiful country.
Said Mother quickly.
I haven't ever been there, I admit, but from what I hear.
He can't be very old, your father.
Said Father, his deep voice silencing them all.
I meant, you're only, 17, 18 years old?
I've just turned 19, Herr Commandant.
So your father would be in his 40s, I expect.
Lieutenant Kotler said nothing but continued to eat, although he didn't appear to be enjoying his food at all.
Strange that he chose not to stay in the fatherland.
Said Father.
We're not close, my father and I.
Said Kotler quickly, looking around the table as if he owed everyone an explanation.
Really, we haven't spoken in years.
And what reason did he give, might I ask?
Continued Father.
For leaving Germany at the moment of her greatest glory and her most vital need, when it is incumbent upon all of us to play our part in the national revival. Was he
Tubercular?
tubercular?
Lieutenant Kotler stared at Father, confused.
I beg your pardon?
He asked.
Did he go to Switzerland to take the air?
Explained Father.
Or did he have a particular reason for leaving Germany in 1938?
He added after a moment.
I'm afraid I don't know, Herr Commandant.
Said Lieutenant Kotler.
You would have to ask him.
Well, that would be rather difficult to do, wouldn't it? With him being so far away, I mean. But perhaps that was it. Perhaps he was ill.
Father hesitated before picking up his knife and fork again and continuing to eat.
Or perhaps he had disagreements.
Disagreements, Herr Commandant?
With government policy. One hears tales of men like this from time to time. Curious fellows, I imagine. Disturbed, some of them. Traitors, others. Cowards too. Of course you have informed your superiors of your father's views, Lieutenant Kotler.
The young lieutenant opened his mouth and then swallowed, despite the fact that he hadn't been eating anything.
Never mind,
said Father cheerfully.
Perhaps it is not an appropriate conversation for a dinner table. We can discuss it in more depth at a later time.
Herr Commandant,
said Lieutenant Kotler, leaning forward anxiously.
I can assure you.
It's not an appropriate conversation for a dinner table,
repeated Father sharply, silencing him immediately, and Bruno looked from one to the other before enjoying and being frightened by the atmosphere at the same time.
I'd love to go to Switzerland,
said Gretel after a lengthy silence.
Eat your dinner, Gretel.
Said Mother.
I was just saying. Eat your dinner.
Mother repeated and was about to say more, but she was interrupted by Father calling for Pavel again.
What's the matter with you tonight?
He asked as Pavel uncorked the new bottle.
This is the fourth time I'd asked for more wine.
Bruno watched him, hoping he was feeling all right, although he managed to release the cork without any accidents. But after he had filled Father's glass and turned to refill Lieutenant Kotler's, he lost his grip of the bottle and somehow it fell crashing, glugging its contents out directly onto the young man's lap. What happened then was an unexpected and extremely unpleasant. Lieutenant Kotler grew very, very angry with Pavel, and no one, not Bruno, not Gretel, not Mother, and not even Father, stepped in to stop him from doing what he did next, even though none of them could watch, even though it made Bruno and Gretel grow pale and cry.